You ready? Mrs. Tibbets asks once he hops in the car. Ben nods. Good. You can put the waders on when we get back to the house, she says. You're going to need them. They drive through the night with the rain pattering on the car roof and the tires hissing over the wet roads. Mrs. Tibbets keeps a one-way conversation going the whole time. He hasn't seen anyone this excited since they took his sister Agatha to ride horses on her 7th birthday. I've never seen a more perfect night. I just can't wait. I'm wondering how many there'll be this year. The last time I was out on the right night, there must have been a dozen pairs. We'll just have to see. A dozen pairs? That's all? Ben asks. That doesn't seem like very many to him. That's all. Of course, when my husband and I first started counting them, there were lots more. As far as I know, no one else has ever spotted any spadefoots in the area. We found a few other vernal pools, but no spadefoots. Ours is the only place. Mrs. Tibbets cuts her sentence short, and Ben looks over at her. There must be some other ones around somewhere, he says. I don't know. There aren't many left. The state now lists them as threatened, on the verge of being endangered. You mean endangered, like almost extinct? Like the golden toads down in Costa Rica? Right. There are still plenty of eastern spadefoots in other states, but their numbers have really dwindled in Massachusetts. Looking at that word dwindled, knowing that we're talking about endangered animals, which means animals that are losing their population, we can infer and use context clues to figure out that dwindled means going down at a high rate. Why? Well, it's the farthest north they can live. There are fewer and fewer places for them to call home. Too many people, too many trees coming down and houses going up, habitat loss. She flips on her turn signal and slows down. But let's not talk about that. Tonight our mission is to see how they're doing. Mrs. Tibbets leans over the steering wheel and peers through the windshield. She slows even more until they're barely moving. What are you doing? Looking for toads or salamanders. This is the place where they hop over the road to get to the pool. I find a couple of squished toads every year. Look! There's something moving right there. Mrs. Tibbets steps on the brake and they lurch to a stop in the middle of the road. She's crazy, Ben thinks. But then he sees a small form in the beam of the headlights. Go, look, Ben. See what it is. Ben looks both ways for cars. The road is quiet and dark in either direction. And then he opens the door. Be careful, Mrs. Tibbets warns. He trots out in front of the station wagon into the path of the headlights. There, 15 feet from the car, is the small, huddled form of a toad. When Ben picks it up, it moves its hind legs feebly as if it's trying to get away, then hunches down in its hands. Ben runs back to Mrs. Tibbets' side of the car, where she's rolled down the window. He holds out the toad, and Mrs. Tibbets shines the flashlight on it. Oh, she mutters, it's just a regular old American toad. Dime a dozen. Still, it's cute. She strokes its head. Ben remembers how she kissed the frog in class. All right, she tells Ben, take this little girl and put her on the other side of the road so she doesn't have to hop across it. She's so cold, she's not moving very fast. Ben carefully puts the toad in the wet grass on the side of the road and then climbs back into the car. When Mrs. Tibbets pulls into the driveway and shuts off the engine, the rain sounds even louder on the roof of the car. You know, Ben, we make a good pair, you and me, out hunting toads. She pockets her keys and opens the car door. Everyone looking for a home. Ben isn't sure what she meant by that last remark, but she's out of the car before he can say anything. Put the boots on, she tells him. Let's go into the backyard. Ben pulls off his sneakers and opens the door so he can pull the big boots on. As soon as he climbs out of the car, Mrs. Tibbets is already scurrying around the side of the house, like a kid hurrying to see what's under the Christmas tree. As I read that, I imagine a child running towards a Christmas tree because they are so excited to see it. That tells me the words scurrying around the side of the house mean that Mrs. Tibbets is very excited about what's happening and moving very quickly. He follows, the rain pattering on the hood of his jacket. He pulls it off his head and feels the cool wetness on his forehead and neck. As he comes around the side of the garage, he's nearly blinded by a bright light. Oh, sorry, says Mrs. Tibbets. The beam switches off, and he can see that she has strapped a light to her forehead so it moves wherever she turns her head. Come on." She motions for him to follow and walks across the grass. When she reaches the edge of the woods, she stops so quickly that Ben bumps into her. She holds up her hand. "Shh," she says. "Just listen." Ben doesn't hear anything at first, at least not anything he hasn't heard already. The rain, the thunder off in the distance, the wind in the trees, the peepers calling, and the toads trilling. "What?" he asks. "Listen! There they are!" Ben listens hard. Then he hears a layer of noise in a lower register. Hum, hum, hum. Like a tree full of crows calling or a bunch of people snoring. "Is that the Spadefoots?" he asks. "That honking sound?" "That's them." They stand there a little while longer, just listening. Finally, without a word, Mrs. Tibbets gestures towards the woods. Flashlights still off, they walk across the yard and across the field. The thunder crashes closer now, and a torrent of rain sweeps past them, and gusts of wind blowing the spidery branches of trees back and forth. Ben shivers. He has to hustle to stay close behind Mrs. Tibbets. This time, she doesn't stop to look at tree bark or wildflowers. She doesn't even look back to make sure he's still there. As they make their way through the woods, the calls get louder. Spadefoot toad voices calling out one after another, grunting for all they're worth. Ben can't help but feel like he's in a fairy tale, following a weird old magical woman deeper into the forest. He can't believe it's actually real. Mrs. Tibbets stops at the edge of the pool. Dripping tree branches droop over the dark water. The pond looks bigger than it did the other day. Mrs. Tibbets puts a finger against her lips. They stand and listen. A riot of sounds rises and falls all around them. They're surrounded by the crazy orchestra, the wind in the trees, the thunder in the sky, the rain pattering on the pool and their jackets, the spring peepers chirping in the distance, and the little Spadefoot toads right before them, leading the symphony. If we look at the back cover uses those quotes direct from the text. This signifies that this is probably a pretty important part of our plot and really important to the storyline. Mrs. Tibbets steps into the pool and motions for Ben to follow. The moment she wades in, the Spadefoot calls stop. "It's all right," Mrs. Tibbets whispers. "They'll start again." Even in wading boots, Ben can feel the cold water around his feet and ankles. He shivers again. He's not sure if it's from cold or excitement. They stand silently, watching. Hum, hum. Another starts up, then several more. Hum, hum, hum. After a minute has passed, Ben figures there must be at least a dozen calling out from different parts of the pool. "There's a lot," Mrs. Tibbets says. Even in the dark, Ben can see she's smiling, and he smiles back. Then she laughs out loud, a high-pitched, girl-like giggle. "Why are you laughing?" "Oh, it's so silly," she says. "What?" "My husband Thomas used to tell a story that he made up when he was little. He said that if you listen carefully when all the toads are out, you can hear the overtoad." "The overtoad?" "Right. It's something he made up, like the king of the toads, or the spirit toad that watches over all the toads in places where they live. And when they're calling out, the overtoad joins in. We used to laugh about it. 'Watch out,' he'd say. 'It's a night for the overtoad.'" Mrs. Tibbets makes a croaking sound. "Can you hear it, Ben? I think tonight is a night for the overtoad." Ben loves the idea of the overtoad. He almost expects to see it rise up from the pool, 25 feet tall, protecting all the little toads. He can't explain why, but he feels a chuckle welling up inside of him. The laughter bubbles out of his throat and sets Mrs. Tibbets to laughing again. Ben tries to stifle his giggles, but the more she laughs, the more he does. This time, noise doesn't seem to bother the toads. They're calling out. Ben catches his breath and tries to imitate the Spadefoot sounds. Hum, hum. Pretty close. Mrs. Tibbets makes a higher-pitched cawing noise. Both of them stand in the pool in the rain, adding their voices to the Spadefoot chorus, calling out to the overtoad. It's crazy and silly and amazing. They're all saying, "We're here! We're here! We're alive! We're alive!" Mrs. Tibbets motions for Ben to come closer to her, and she switches on the light strapped around her head. She shines it around the pool, turning this way and that, and then stops the beam on a branch sticking up out of the pool. She leans over so Ben can hear her above all the noise. Look, there. Ben sees the little spadefoot in the spotlight, resting on a branch floating on the surface of the water. Mrs. Tibbets wades over to it, and Ben follows. She picks up the toad carefully and directs the light to the branch. Just below it, there's another toad swimming through the water. She scoops that one up, too, so she has one in each hand. This is the male, the one that was calling. Here's the female. She turns it over. See how fat it is? It has a bunch of eggs to lay. Here, take a toad. The male spadefoot crouches low in Ben's hand. It's smooth, not like the other toads he's held. He can clearly see the 2 yellow stripes on its back. The eyes are shiny metallic gold. Mrs. Tibbet strokes her toad's head. Just think, she says. They come here every spring. This little pool has been home for the ancestors of these toads for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. They were probably here before people even lived in this area. Wow, says Ben. Wow, Mrs. Tibbets repeats. Cute little guy. Yeah. Ben can feel the toad's smooth belly on his palm. Imagine a family living in a place for thousands of years. Imagine, says Mrs. Tibbets. They let the toads slip back into the water and watch them swim to the branch. Let's count the couples, Mrs. Tibbets suggests. Trying as best they can to avoid counting any toads twice, they wade around the pool looking and listening for the spadefoots. Working in the rain for half an hour, they come up with 16 pairs and 6 individuals. That's several more than last year, Mrs. Tibbets says. Great! It is great. It's wonderful. I think we're all done. They wade out of the pool and stand on its edge, very close to one another. It's still noisy, with the rain and the wind and the thunder and the toads and the frogs, but Ben feels quiet inside. And suddenly, he knows it's time. Mrs. Tibbets? Yes, Ben? Stop and make a prediction right here about what's going to happen next. I let your snakes go. She turns her head. She's still got her headlamp on, and the bright light hurts her eyes. He can barely make out the details of her mouth and eyes and nose. She's looking right at him. He holds his breath, wondering what she'll say. Oh, she says. Ben shuts his eyes to keep out the light. It was an accident. I didn't mean to. I was curious, but I shouldn't have messed with the cage. I'm really, really sorry. I'm sorry if they got out and died. I didn't mean for it to happen. She doesn't speak, and then she feels her hand on his shoulder. It's all right, Ben, she says. I'm sorry, too. But thank you for telling me. The relief is tremendous. He doesn't know why, but he begins to cry. Great sobs come up from deep inside of him, catching him totally off guard. Mrs. Tibbets switches off her headlamp and puts her arm around him. They stand there awkwardly by the side of the pool. The rain splats against their raincoats. Ben's body heaves up and down, and he can't make it stop. I'm sorry. Ben takes a deep breath and lets his sobs subside. I'm sorry, he repeats over and over again. I'm so sorry. Of course you are, his teacher says over the sound of the rain. Anyway, doesn't really matter about the snakes now. She pauses and then she says, maybe they'll find a new home somewhere else. Wiping his face, Ben looks up at her. At first he thinks it's the rain, but then he sees there are tears on her cheeks, too. Why are you crying? Oh, I'm sorry, too. For me? Yes, for you, and for all this. She sweeps her arm in a semicircle, gesturing to everything around her. What do you mean? Nothing, she says. No, really. What are you sorry about? She shakes her head again. Does it have to do anything to do with your sister-in-law and the other day? She doesn't answer. What's happening? Is it something about your home? In a way. Why? How? It's very complicated, Ben. Tell me, please, Ben says. He really wants to know. For a moment, just a second, he doesn't see Mrs. Tibbets as a teacher. It's like he's looking at her through a magical pair of binoculars that shows who someone really is, not how they fit in his own little model of the world. Mrs. Tibbets sniffs and laughs again, wiping the rain and the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. Well, fair is fair. You told me your secret, and I'll tell you mine. But let's do it inside over something warm. I love those toads, but I certainly am not one of them." She turns away from the pool and heads down the trail toward the house. The whole way back, Ben listens to the toads calling out, "We're here! We're alive! We're here!"